Well, good evening, Key City Church. It is so fantastic to be with you guys this evening. It's always such a privilege and an honor to have you guys joining us here to worship together, and we just appreciate having you with us. So thank you for joining us as we start into part two in a series where we are talking about something that is kind of a big deal to us here at Key City Church because it was kind of a big deal to the church 2,000 years ago. In fact, it's so big of a deal that this thing is the kind of thing that when this thing is gotten wrong, all kinds of things start to go wrong. That when we get this thing wrong, cracks start to show up, things start to unravel, things start to fall apart. In fact, you could call it foundational. And we understand foundational because we all know the importance of a foundation. The importance of the foundation is that everything else gets built on the foundation, regardless of what it is you're building. And, you know, what we talked about the first week that we were here together doing this series was that what makes a good foundation, or the principle of a foundation, is this, that a good foundation must be sufficient to support what you're building, of any foundation, regardless of what you're going to build, the foundation has to be sufficient to support what you're building. And if you've bought a house, you understand this really well because one of the first things that happens when you are buying a house is the inspector comes and looks, and the first thing that they look at is the foundation, right? Because if the foundation isn't right, everything else is at risk, right? If the foundation isn't sufficient, it doesn't matter how big the house is, it doesn't matter how beautiful the house is, it doesn't matter how well maintained the house is. If the foundation isn't sufficient, or if there's any crack or any problems with the foundation, it puts everything else at risk, right? Because the foundation is what holds it in the midst of all the other forces and pressures that push against the house. The foundation is critical. And sort of critical regardless of what it is you're building, whether you're building a marriage or you're building a business or you're building a legal case, whatever you're building, the foundation is critical. And it's the same thing when it comes to our faith, that what we are building our faith on has to be sufficient to hold our faith, our trust, our confidence, our hope, what it is we were looking to know that at the end of the day, everything is going to be okay, that what we build that on has to be sufficient to hold it, and to hold it regardless of the external pressures, to be able to hold our faith regardless of the challenges that come from outside, regardless of the change in circumstances that we might go to, regardless of the challenges or new information or questions or doubts, regardless of even our own inconsistencies. That our faith, that the foundation has to be sufficient to hold our faith. And what a lot of us have experienced, I imagine, is what happens when our faith is built on a foundation that isn't sufficient to hold it. And that's not to say bad you or bad on you, like you didn't have the right foundation, like what's wrong with you? Because so often our foundation comes from the version of faith that we were handed, the version of faith that we grew up with, or the version of faith that we were raised to believe. That version of faith poured for us or laid for us a foundation that wasn't sufficient to hold our faith. And when the scandal broke out at the church, you saw your faith start to unravel. When you sat in that college class and listened to the professor just tear down like all of the arguments for your faith, piece by piece by piece, and you felt so exposed and so vulnerable and felt like you had nothing left to stand on. And that moment when the circumstances of your life completely change and you didn't think that God could allow this to happen to someone who loved him so much. When life just gets upset, when things start to fall apart, or when our doubts come in, we realize that maybe I can't believe like I used to believe, and we watch our faith start to unravel. The problem isn't that something was wrong with your faith, that so often it's just built on a foundation that isn't sufficient to hold it. And the good news for all of us is that 2,000 years ago, Jesus was so clear about what the foundation of our faith is supposed to be. He was so clear about it that it was the foundation that the early church was built on. So the church is always meant to be built on. And regardless of the foundation that you're building on, that you were taught to build on, or that you're thinking about, or you're learned to build on, regardless, it's the foundation that you can build on too. And in case you weren't with us when we did our the first part of this series, or for all of us, because it was so long ago that we did the first part of this series. It was 2 weeks ago, and we just can't remember what happened 2 weeks ago. It's a long time ago. In fact, I asked my wife, Monica, last night, I was like, hey, what do you think people are expecting to hear in part 2 of this series? And she said, well, what was part 1? Well, yeah, all right. So we're going to get all caught up on what we covered in part 1 of the series, so we all know where we are. And where we started this was recognizing that when we read the accounts of Jesus' life by Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, they write about Jesus' 3.5-year ministry. At the end of Jesus' life, his public ministry, where he was going around and teaching crowds and healing people, it lasted for 3.5 years. And over those 3.5 years, Jesus didn't just claim to know things about God. He didn't just claim to be a representative of God, but Jesus claimed to be God. And he was so explicit about it and so clear about it that one of the eyewitness followers, one of the closest followers of Jesus, like one of Jesus' inner three, one of them, a man named John, when John wrote his account of the life of his friend Jesus, here's how he started the whole thing out. He said, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And John's just trying to be really clear here, the Word equals God. When I say Word, you hear God. When I say God, he said, Word equals God. Now listen, the Word became flesh. The divine, the God, put skin on, and he made his dwelling among us. That God has come and abide to show us what he's like. Jesus claimed to be God, and because of who he claimed to be, Jesus never equivocated. He didn't equivocate, but he invited the full weight of their faith. He invited their faith. And the word that Jesus would have used for faith could have been translated faith or belief or trust. It was a Greek word, pisteuo. It just means to put trust in, to believe in, to have confidence in, to have faith in, to put our hope in. And Jesus' invitation over his 3.5 years of public ministry was always for people to believe in him. Not to believe in things about him, not to believe facts, not to believe in things that he had done, but to believe in him. In him. And just to color out belief a little bit more so that we're all on the same page when we talk about belief, trust, it's what answers the question or what finishes the statement that I believe at the end of the day, everything is going to be okay, that whatever happens, whatever might unravel, however badly things might go, I have confidence that at the end of everything, at the end of the day, everything's going to be okay because. And whatever goes after that because is what you have faith in, is what you trust. Is what you have hope in. It's what you have confidence in. And Jesus' invitation was for people to have that confidence in him. Not in theology, not in doctrine, not in sacred places, not in sacred texts, but in him. Now you can imagine when somebody shows up and claims to be God and invites people to trust them, it leaves a lot of everybody starts asking the question, well, who do you think you are? You claim to be God? prove it, especially as Jesus was teaching crowds of people. The people who asked that the most were the Jewish religious leaders who were hyper insecure about who Jesus was, and he'd come to challenge their teachings. They wanted to see, where are your credentials? You claim to be God? Prove it. Now, just imagine, use your imagination for this. Imagine that you were God, the divine behind everything, and you decide to show up into your own creation. How do you convince them that you're God without terrifying the garbage out of everybody, right? How do you convince them that, there's not like an office that you can go to have your God card printed that you can show them your ID. How do you demonstrate, how do you show your credibility? So what Jesus did to demonstrate his credibility, to show that he was who he claimed to be, throughout his life, he made a prediction. And he predicted, you're going to kill me. But 3 days later, I will rise again. And he said it over and over. He repeated it throughout his life. But it didn't make sense. And nobody understood it. And nobody got it. And then at the end of his life, when they killed him, just like they said he would, nobody was standing outside of the tomb counting down to resurrection, right? Nobody was waiting for Jesus to pull off what he said he was going to do, because nobody was expecting that inside of the tomb was nobody, right? They expected that when Jesus died, he was going to stay dead. And as we discovered together last time, when Jesus died, his movement died with him. And his closest followers hid behind locked doors, because if the leaders would kill Jesus, just imagine what they would do to them. And the whole thing had stopped, and the posters came down, and the t-shirts came off, and everybody went into hiding. And we should have never heard about Jesus, except that after they killed him, 3 days later, he rose again, just like he said he would. And just weeks after that, we find the disciples in the streets of Jerusalem. They've gone from hiding to save their lives to risking their lives. And the church started, and the Jesus movement started. And the reason that we're here today, the reason that there is a church today, the reason that you've heard the name of Jesus is because Jesus rose from the dead just like he said he would, to give credibility to the fact that he was who he claimed to be. Now, we are all caught up. So if you checked out for the review because you're like, I already know all this, I heard this before and I remember it, well, gold star for you. Good job. Now tune back in, because this is where we pick back up. And this is so fascinating, and I love this. Just imagine Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, standing in the room with his disciples, who were not counting down to resurrection, who were not expecting resurrection. What was so astonishing to them about this, wasn't just that Jesus had risen from the dead like he said he would. And what was so astonishing to them wasn't that his resurrection validated his claim to be God, as astonishing as that was. The astonishing part wasn't that God had been in their midst, which is a pretty big thing to get your mind around all of a sudden, to realize, all this time it's been God. The astonishing thing to his disciples wasn't just that this was God, but that this was God, and this is what he's like. Not just this is God, and this is what he's like. Just imagine the next 40 days as Jesus met with his disciples. Imagine as it sunk into them the interactions and the events that had played out over the past 3.5 years, as they thought back and were like, wait a second, that was God who did that. Like, how astonishing would that have to be? Just imagine the conversations that they had as they realized that this was God. As Peter remembered that first day on the beach after a night of fishing, and they were cleaning their nets, and along came this rabbi, this teacher, who talked Peter somehow into taking his nets and putting him in the boat and going back out again. And somehow Peter allowed a rabbi to teach him, to talk him into going back out and letting down the nets again. And he did it and pulled in so many fish that the boat started to sink. And all of a sudden, Peter realized he was in the presence of somebody that he didn't know who this was. But suddenly he felt ashamed, and he felt insignificant, and he felt unworthy, and he fell at his knees. And Jesus said to him, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. From now on, you will fish for people. And it occurred to Peter that this wasn't just the comforting words of a rabbi, but that God had gotten in the same boat with him. And as it occurred to Matthew, as it all began to sink in for Matthew, and Matthew realized and remembered the day that he was sitting at the tax collector's booth, Matthew, who was collecting taxes on behalf of the imperial Roman Empire, collecting taxes from his family members and his friends and his countrymen. Matthew, who was looked at as a traitor, who watched people walk past his tax collector booth all day long and just look at him with hatred and spit at him, who felt so ashamed. And the day that he watched Jesus approach the tax collector's booth, and how he waited to hear the condemnation, but instead heard Jesus say, follow me. And instead of condemnation, he got invitation. And as it occurred to Matthew that when he looked back and saw the hope-filled, welled up with love eyes of Jesus, he was looking into the eyes of God. And as they talked, and as the disciples, as it all just continued to sink in, as they realized that when Jesus was out teaching crowds of people, and they looked around at the people who were coming to Jesus, I mean, there were people who were like them, people who are nothing like Jesus, who liked Jesus. And what they saw in Jesus was that Jesus liked them back. And the day that they were listening to Jesus teach the crowds, and the religious leaders started murmuring amongst themselves, this man welcomes sinners. And it dawned on them that this was God, that God welcomes, receives, pulls in, accepts sinners. And it occurred to them, like all their lives growing up in Sunday school and all those lessons about God is so holy that he can't be in the presence of sin. But here was God welcoming sinners. And how it had prompted Jesus, how Jesus, hearing these words and these murmurings of the religious leaders, as it prompted Jesus to tell a story about a son who spurned his father's love, who requested his inheritance early, who wandered off and squandered it all in wild living and partying until he had nothing left, and the shame and the guilt and depravity that he had and all of it, until he got to the point where he's like, it would be better to be a hired hand with my father. And makes the decision to travel back to his father and beg for his father's forgiveness and ask his father to just let him be one of his hired workers. And how Jesus had said that as he approached, while he was still a long way off, his father saw him because his father had been watching for him, been waiting for him, and was filled. And they would have remembered how when Jesus got to this part of the story, how he got choked up and he could barely get it out. That the Father was filled with compassion for him. And it occurred to them, this wasn't a rabbi telling a story about an ethereal God, but it was God trying to convey to his children, hey, it is safe to come home. It is safe to turn around. You are welcome. You are welcome with me in my home, just as you are. And to remember back to that last meal that they had with Jesus as they sat around the table together, and it was just so somber, and they didn't realize why Jesus was so somber and serious because they had no idea what was going to happen. And Jesus had looked around the table at all of them, and he told them, greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. They didn't get it. It didn't make sense. But the next day, I mean, just think of them. Think about the disciples remembering back to watching their friend Jesus get falsely accused of leading an insurrection, become arrested, be beaten, forced to carry his own cross, and then nailed to the cross as they realized, wait, that wasn't just a rabbi. That wasn't just our friend Jesus. That was God, like the God, the divine, the one who is above and beyond and behind and over everything. That God would allow himself to be nailed to a cross. The God who just in a moment could just make it all stop, and who didn't lift a finger in retaliation, didn't lift a finger in resistance. Because if what you want is to win someone's faith, if what you want is to earn someone's trust, like real trust, like big trust, like I recognize, like I can trust. If you want to earn someone's trust, what do you have to prove? What do you have to prove to someone to earn their trust? You have to prove that you are safe, that you are for them, that you will be unconditionally for them. Whatever they do, when they're at their worst, when they are driven to make mistakes through fear and insecurity, that you will be for them. When they think that they are doing the righteous thing in their religiosity, that you will be for them. That when they are at their worst, you will be for them. To the point that you would be willing to lay down your life for them. And as it occurred to the disciples, this wasn't just a rabbi. This was the God. It's why when John was writing his introduction to the life of Jesus, he didn't just stop with, and the Word was God. He went on. He said, the Word became flesh. He made his dwelling among us. Like, God came and hung out with us, people, and we've seen his glory. We saw what God is like. And if we could sit down with John and hang out with John, we'd all ask the same question. Well, if you saw what God was like, what was he like? And John says, I'll tell you. He was full of grace and truth. And truth is the word that means the making known of something that is previously unknown. This is John saying, like, the divine that we just can't get our minds around. He's made himself knowable. He's taken off the veil of secrecy. Like he's pulled back the curtains and he's showed us what he's like. And he's full of grace. Unconditional, unmerited, unearnable, unlosable acceptance. God came to show us what he's like. Oh my gosh, and he's so good. In fact, John would, over the years, condense this down even further. He's like, you want to know what God is like? If God is like Jesus, well, then God is love. Full stop. Jesus invites the full weight of our faith, our trust, our confidence, our hope, not just because he's God, but because he's good. Oh, because he's good. Now, let's just ask a question and reflect on this a moment. Isn't it true that your faith needs a who, right? Isn't that true that your faith, your trust, your confidence, your hope, isn't it true that your faith needs a who? Because what can a what ever do, right? Whats can be good. There are a lot of good whats. And there's some whats that we even depend on. But when we talk about the kind of faith that Jesus invited from us, that allows us to say, at the end of the day, everything is going to be okay because, will a what ever satisfy that? I mean, because what we're talking about here is the foundation for our faith. Like, what does our faith sit on top of? Can a what ever be sufficient for your confidence, your trust, your hope, or your faith? Could a what ever do that? I mean, whats are good, but can a what ever be for you? I mean, whats are good, but can a what be benevolent towards you? Can a what ever desire your best and want to see your highest? Can a what work all things together for good, right? Can a what ever ensure justice is achieved in the universe? Can a what ever satisfy the longings and the hungers and the thirsts of our soul? Can a what ever bring restoration in our universe? Can a what do that? No. You find me a what that satisfies that. Well, I'd like to see what that is. Because a what will never, nothing that fits in the category of what will ever be sufficient for your faith. Anytime you find yourself putting your faith, setting it on, resting it on a what, it's going to let you down because a what, anything that fits in the category of what, is never going to be sufficient for your faith because it's true that your faith, needs a who, right? And that means that doctrine is never going to be sufficient to hold your faith. Because at the end of everything, doctrine isn't going to reset the universe and make it all right. Theology isn't sufficient to hold your faith. Your confidence in what you believe isn't sufficient to hold your faith. Your obedience isn't sufficient to hold your faith. A church system isn't sufficient to hold your faith. A sacred place isn't sufficient to hold your faith. A sacred text, as good as it is, isn't sufficient to hold your faith because at the end of the day, it's not going to bring justice within the universe. Your faith, this is true, your faith needs a who. A what will never do. Now, what more could a who do to earn your trust from you, right? What more could a who, or specifically the who is behind everything, and is responsible for everything and is over and above and beyond everything, what more could that who do to earn your trust from you, right? If you're waiting for a God that is good, if it's not Jesus, what better God are you expecting to come along, right? And just, think about this for a moment. Can you come up with a version of God that is better than Jesus, that is kinder, more loving, more forgiving, more just, and more good than Jesus? Right? Humanity has never encountered a God who loves sinners until Jesus. Or think about it this way. If you could create any kind of God that you wanted, whatever God you like, wouldn't we end up with a God like Jesus? A God who actually includes everybody, who desires everybody, who wants what's best for everybody, who truly loves and forgives and offers grace and mercy and offers restoration for everybody? Isn't that the kind of God that at the end of the day we would all want? Like if we could create a God of our own creation, isn't this the kind of God that we would create? And this argument isn't that just because we would want it to be true, it is true. But here's what it recognizes. It recognizes that in our heart, in our soul, the longings of our soul, we desire is a God like Jesus. And maybe that's a clue, right? That might not be the evidence that you base your trust on, but maybe that's a clue to the fact that maybe, just maybe, Jesus truly is who he claimed to be, and he's sufficient for your faith. Because if Jesus isn't sufficient for your faith, if you wouldn't trust a God like Jesus, what kind of God would you be waiting to come along to trust? Right? Or just think about it this way. If God, and this isn't like trying to change your mind about anything, but I'm just saying if God were like Jesus, if he truly were, if it could be just proven to you beyond a shadow of doubt and you just knew, if God were just like Jesus, wouldn't you trust him? Wouldn't that be the kind of God that you would want? If you could have the kind of God that you wanted, right? Wouldn't we all like a God like that? And so Jesus invites the full weight of our faith, not just because he's God, but because he's good. And for that reason, 2,000 years ago, Jesus stood in the dry, dusty Judean desert after teaching the crowds and healing people all day long. And he was walking along during the evening with his disciples. And they were all hot and tired, and they just wanted to get home and take a shower. And Jesus, like Jesus always does, just wanted to take an opportunity for a teaching moment. He just paused, and he asked them all. He said, Who do the people say the Son of Man is? And the Son of Man was just a title that Jesus used to refer to himself. Who do the people say I am? Who? And they threw out a bunch of guesses. Some say, Elijah. Some say, all these other. They just threw out all these. They didn't know. So Jesus went on. He said, well, who do you say I am? Who do you say I am? And Peter, just the one who's always the first one to open his mouth and usually the first one to put his foot in. Peter says, well, you're the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Like, you're the one that we've been waiting for, the one we've been looking forward to, the one that we've been waiting to bring restoration to the world. And Jesus looks at him and he says, you're right. You're right. And on this rock, because of who? On the rock of who I am. On this rock I will build my church. And the gates of Hades, or in other words, death itself, will not overcome it. Jesus intended to build a movement, to build a community, to build a faith, not on a what, but on who he was. And he would go to the cross. He'd lay down his life to prove that he is a God who is for us, only to take his life up again to demonstrate not only that he is God, but to demonstrate who God is, that God is like him. To show that not only is he God, but that he's good. And the Jesus movement started to grow. And the Jesus movement started to gain steam. And it started to spread throughout the Roman Empire. Not just because he was God, but because he was good. And what I love to read are historians' accounts of the spread of the Jesus movement throughout the Roman Empire, especially historians that aren't followers of Jesus, because what they typically say is, of course it spread. Of course it spread. Because who wouldn't want a God like that? Like, it spread because here are these poor people who were taught about these national deities that were so exclusive, and there were all these things that you had to do to satisfy them. And here's this God who loves sinners. They're like, who wouldn't want that? Who wouldn't want to be who wouldn't put their faith in a God like that? Of course it spread. To which we say, amen, right? It was good news 2,000 years ago, and it's good news still. And we believe that it's good news right now. And it's what our faith and the church was meant to be built on, that there's a God who is actually good. And when we interact with, as we've interacted with, and if we've heard the stories from and read the stories of the increasing numbers of people who are walking out of and away from or never into a church to begin with, what we hear over and over again in the stories never has anything to do with the who. It's never because of who God revealed himself to be in the person of Jesus. In fact, most people recognize that if God were like Jesus, well, I think I'd like a God like that. And the problem comes along with the what that gets built on top of the who. And when the what becomes mistaken for the foundation. And when people walk out, and when people walk away, and when faith unravels, when faith falls apart, so often it's because the what has replaced the who. And a what can't support your faith. And what we're going to be talking about next week, and I hope that you'll join us back here next week, we're going to be talking about the whats that tend to replace the who, and what happens when you build your faith on a what instead of a who. But until then, I want to encourage you that the who, the Jesus, is sufficient for your faith. The foundation doesn't change, even though what's built on top of it may. In fact, sometimes what's built on top of it has to change. In fact, sometimes what's built on top of it isn't sufficient for life when life comes along. And sometimes we have to have demolition. And sometimes we have to remodel. And sometimes we have to tear down to build back up again. But through all of it, the foundation is secure. Jesus doesn't move, and he doesn't give way, and he never stops being for you and inviting you to trust him. Jesus invites the full weight of our faith, not just because he's God, but because he's good. Would you guys pray with me? God, we are so grateful for you. Because of your goodness, we desire so much that you would draw us closer and closer to you as we learn to lean into you, to put our faith, our trust, our confidence in you. Because we believe that you are for us. That you desire nothing but our best. And you have gone to the greatest lengths to prove it to us. To make yourself vulnerable to us. That in response and in vulnerability, we would come near to you. And we just pray that your Spirit would allow us to let down our guard a little bit, our defenses a little bit, to open ourselves up a little bit more to you. And we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.